Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And the second of our double bill, we had David on earlier giving us a fantastic breakdown of Operation, the raid on Gronville. But now we are at Veritable. Operation Veritable, we've explored a few times on World War II TV, most recently with Dermot Rooney, whose forthcoming book on Veritable I am most looking forward to. But in our ongoing series of Canadian panel discussions, our three musketeers, David, Mike, and Arthur, return for their perspectives on Veritable. So, hello, chaps. How are we all today?
Good. Good afternoon.
Doing great, thanks.
Good. So, Operation Veritable, we were just talking about with David half an hour ago about the Gronville raid of March 45 being kind of a last hurrah for the German army or Navy forces and not really affecting much. But by February 45, the feeling is the writing is on the wall now. There's only going to be one outcome. So, David, I know you're finishing your breakfast there, but if you can give us kind of a rundown on where we are in the ETO in February 45, then Mike's going to give us the Canadian Army's perspective, then Arthur's the Germans, and then we're going to go have our normal free-for-all. So, David, where are we in February 45?
Well, by the time we get to February 45, essentially, as you said, the curtain is coming down. And there's no doubt that the Germans are on the retreat. It looks highly unlikely that there's going to be any kind of serious counterattack coming in. They have spent shot their bolt in not only the Ardennes, but a little later on as well in another smaller counterattack that happened in January. But now it's just a question of protecting the Reich. And the Germans now are digging in and they are trying to make the Reich as formidable as possible. Of course, they're taking a beating on the Eastern Front. The Russians are advancing like gangbusters at this time. And in the Pacific, it's also getting down to the end. And of course, you're getting ready for the invasion of Iwo Jima and then later on Okinawa. So we're in that final few months of the war. But I think what really is interesting here is the tone. The tone changes for the Allies. Up until this point, they have been liberators. And without a doubt, they are now being told to go in to Germany like conquerors. Yeah. The attitude is changing. And this really sets the context for the kind of battles that we're going to be talking about today.
Brilliant. And Mike, it's been a bad winter in terms of morale. I mean, one of the things we don't talk about enough is it's a real bit of low point in terms of desertion and self-inflicted wounds across the ETO in the Pacific. Everyone's war weary, and the Canadians in the ETO have been at it a long time without really any reshuffling of units. There's new replacements coming in, but it's the same divisions in the same front line since a long time. So remind us where the Canadians are and what they've been doing since we were last talking about the Scheldt in November.
Yeah, of course. And I mean, we can't forget that the Canadians had a reinforcement crisis in the fall of 1944, largely due to operations in the Scheldt, starting in Normandy. And there was a shortage of trained infantrymen, and that was a big problem for the Canadians that led to a conscription crisis back on the home front. These are big issues for Canada, bringing back bad memories from the First World War when conscription threatened to divide and maybe break up the country. So these are big challenges. I think it's really important to remember that the men on the ground didn't know that the war was going to end in May, that the British chiefs of staff as late as January were looking at the war continuing until at least the end of 1945, that we so often hear in context of the bombing of Dresden, which of course happened in mid-February 1945, the same time the Canadians and the Brits are heavily engaged in the Rhineland, that this shouldn't have happened because the war was almost over. Why would you destroy this city when the war is about to be over? Well, that's 2020 hindsight. That's people who know how it ends commenting, not based on what was actually known at the time. For the Canadians and the Brits in the Rhineland, this was some of the nastiest, most intense high casualty combat that they faced in the entire Second World War. So if you'd ask the average Canadian, the average Brit, or frankly the average German who are in the front lines at this point in the war, there's no end coming. There's only today, tomorrow, and maybe the next day, and they're just looking to get it done. So you can't blame the Allies for going all out to get this war over as soon as possible. Now, the Canadians have been pretty much out of the fight since the end of the Scheldt. After the Scheldt battle, They sort of went into reserve to lick their wounds, to rebuild, to reintegrate infantry reserves and others. And they used it really positively as a time for enrichment. There was a lot of thinking, a lot of schools going on, a lot of planning. How do we incorporate the lessons of Normandy, of the Scheldt, and so forth into our future combat operations? And it's really interesting to read through the war diaries in this period, because you see constant transfer of troops back and forth as they're sent off to schools to learn about infantry tactics or artillery or things like that. There's a lot of work on planning for air support, and there's mutual visits between RAF officers going to the Canadian Army and vice versa, trying to figure out how we can best do this. And I think we see the results of this in the Rhineland. The Canadian Army is a very, very effective weapon, and it makes use of all of the tools at its disposal. And we'll see a little bit more about that as we go on today.
So, Arthur, you've written about the German units in Normandy particularly, but where are the Germans in terms of their strengths? I mean, they've still shown in the Bulge and some of these other counterattacks, they've still got some bite. They've still got the capability to put groups together. They've got people in the field, but they're not. What their problem is they can't deal with drawn out battles. Anything they do, there has to be fairly quick. So give us a rundown of the German strengths as we go into the beginning of 45.
Yes, the German divisions defending the front line are very weak, and they have a set, these are almost cannon fodder type divisions with troops that are medium to low quality. And bits and pieces of them are very, very good, but the majority of the very good, well-equipped units fought in the Ardennes, and right now on the Eastern Front is the absolute apocalypse of the Soviet offensive that has burst out from the gates of Warsaw and is now attacking into Silesia and Pomerania and headed towards Berlin. Through now, a huge number of units are also getting diverted to fight in Hungary. So what you have left in the area that we're going to talk about today, the Rhineland, is a very weak unit, the 84th Infantry Division, which has 3 Grenadier regiments, but these are very, very weak and poorly equipped in the way of the divisional artillery. And this is just coming off the effects of Operation Bodenplatte, base plate for the Luftwaffe, which they did their massive attack to wipe out the tactical Air Force bases or airfields of the Allies in the West, and they suffered tremendous casualties. Now, because of what's happening on the Eastern Front, the Luftwaffe is sent into a ground attack role to stop the Russian tanks. But now I've finished with the bad news. Here's what's good for the Germans. This is excellent defensive country. Yeah. These forests, these rivers, river after river, the floodplains, and it's February. Everything is melting. The roads in the Rhineland, which we'll be talking about today, are mainly north-south, rather than the Canadian armies and the 1st Canadian armies attacking, in a sort of a southeastern direction with the British 30 Corps. So we don't have those good roads. We just have the muddy German lumberjack, forest tracks, the bits and pieces of the Western Wall, which are not concrete defenses, but they're just earthen bunkers that are not very good. And you have, one assault gun or Jagdpanzer, Schwer Jagdpanzer battalion with a number of self-propelled assault guns to help the defenders. And then they have the reserve, which is the 47th Panzer Corps, which is very, very weak because it has been absolutely demolished in the Ardennes. But luckily, there's no real area. There's one area where they actually do have their little tank battle, but there's no areas for a large amount of armor to deploy. And where they've got to go is through these muddy tracks and through forests. And it's just lines of trenches. And there's 3 German defensive lines. One is on the western side of the Reich Wall. The second one is the northern part of the Siegfried line around the Matterborn and Cleve area. And the 3rd defensive line is coming down from the town of Ries on the Rhine, just going to the Hochwald and the Bauberger forests. So you have 3 defensive lines, and the Ardennes offensive has been tremendously good for the Germans in this area, because this attack on Operation Plunder with the Americans, or Operation Grenade, excuse me, was supposed to go much earlier, but this stopped due to the fighting in the Ardennes and the redeployment of a large number of British units. And of course, this is very good for the Germans. They can build their trenches and their obstacles and this and that, but at the same time, they're very, very weak. So while this is the perfect defensive country, the Germans, unfortunately, tragically for them, they do not have enough forces of a strong enough nature to actually do the actual winning defensive battle.
Brilliant stuff. So David and Mike and Arthur, we've already mentioned air power, and artillery is going to be a big part of it. So artillery and air power are two assets the Allies have that aren't really affected by the conditions on the ground. So, roads, forests, logging tracks, that's not really going to affect the air power. When we come to moving the infantry and the tanks and the ground forces, that, of course, is going to be really snarled up by that road network. But Mike, as our air power expert, and we will plug your book, which we did with Matt on Friday. The air power it's a huge advantage the Allies had by 1945. I mean, are we on the brink of supremacy now? It's still superiority, but are we in total charge now after Bodenplatte?
Oh, absolutely. There's very little opposition to the Allied air forces and what they want to do and where they want to do it and when they want to do it. And in fact, in the Rhineland, they have an added advantage in that Allied artillery is so dominant that when the Allied aircraft are in the area, they British and Canadian artillery fire counter battery on German anti-aircraft guns, and the RAF notices this and comments on the fact that they're able to go about their missions without dealing with light, medium, and heavy AAA. So these are a really big advantage. Now, that being said, it wasn't all roses for air power. February, March were rough months weather-wise, and as you go through the reports, you can see that probably 50% of days there was no or limited air power employed in the area because the weather was too bad. It was too cloudy. It was too snowy. There was rain. For whatever reason, air power couldn't play a role. And then they also have the problems of those forests. The same forests that stop the tanks and so forth also hide the Germans, and air power was very ineffective in a direct way on German positions in those forests because they simply couldn't find where they were. They can do kind of aerial suppression kind of stuff in terms of dropping bombs and hoping for the best, but that really wasn't a very effective use of air power. Not just the fighter bombers were used. There was a lot of heavies and mediums that were employed in this battle, but they were used beyond the battlefield. They were directed at the major transport hubs of Wiesel and Goch and Emmerich and places like that, where some of these German towns were absolutely leveled, ostensibly to create roadblocks and to deny the Germans the ability to move their troops around. And I think they were fairly effective in doing that, but it came at a pretty high cost for those German cities and villages.
David, we can't have you on without talking about Intel and Ultra and things like that, and that's part of the reason we love you so much. But it's the Ardennes was the Allies having to react to the Germans. The Allies have been in many ways dictating what's been going on since June 44, but the Ardennes sort of throws a sparrow into the works. By February, it's back to the Allies setting the scene. The Allies are dictating what's going to go on. But so how much of an intel picture do the Allies have about what to expect from these Germans? Obviously, as Arthur mentioned a bit in the sidebar, they're defending the homeland now. That's going to add a whole extra level of bite to this, but they are depleted. They've been resoundingly kicked out of the Ardennes. What is our intel picture telling us about the Germans' likelihood to fall back or fight the last round? What do we know?
Well, generally speaking, you have a hard time figuring out intent. You can try to as much as possible. And that's one of the big problems. The work I've done on Dieppe, one of the problems was not necessarily underestimating the size of the German defense, but actually the capabilities and their effectiveness. That's the tough part. So that's really the big question going in here. Yes, their backs are against the wall. Yes, they are weakened, but they are fighting on home territory. So that's another, tangible that gets into the mix. Also, too, Allied intelligence has been keeping a finger on the pulse right since January. So they've built up a very good picture, not only from signals intelligence, but all more traditional style of intelligence as well. A lot of patrol work, a lot of aerial reconnaissance, and it's all coming down. As a matter of fact, I think you and I, Woody, were talking about this briefly when we were setting this up. There was a really remarkable story about a kid from the Black Watch, a young lieutenant by the name of Sammy Nichols, who contributes to this intelligence picture in no small measure, which is really unique given all the technical things. And just in a very quick summation of that, he takes a Black Watch patrol, just a 3 or 4 man patrol, reconnaissance patrol, out on January 1st, gets ambushed. And as he comes back, he realizes he's lost one of his men. So he basically takes out another patrol. Now, of course, probably not a good thing to do, going back to the exact same spot. Sure enough, the Germans are in wait again. They ambush him again. He's taken prisoner. And as he's being marched back into the Reichswald forest, he actually has, what we assume he has, was a photographic memory. And so what he's doing is he's remembering everything he is seeing, the layout of the German defenses in the area that he's going through. He's remembering call signs that he's overhearing. He's looking at divisional marker signs. It's amazing what he's collecting. And of course, he figures that based on what he's heard about the Ardennes and the Malmedy massacre, that he's going to be bumped off pretty quickly. He's not. He's actually taken back into the Reichswald, put in basically a chicken coop before he's sent off. But he's smart enough and has the wherewithal to plan his escape. And what he does is he feigns dysentery. So in other words, for the next 24 hours, he goes to the washroom about 20 times and asks to be escorted out to the latrine. As he's doing that, he's scoping everything out as he goes. But in addition to laying out his escape route, he's also picking up more intel, which is remarkable. He eventually makes his escape the next day, and the very cagey bugger he was, instead of going straight back towards Canadian lines, he went towards German lines, button hooked, and came back. So he basically threw the Germans off. Now, he does reach Canadian lines, and because he's been gone for about a week, he doesn't know the password and is almost killed by Black Watch sentries coming in. But when they find out and they sit down and they do the interrogation, it's incredible. And I've posted it on Facebook before, and you guys can find it. It's in the 2nd Division files for January of 1945. His interrogation report that the Canadians do on him, and it's 3 pages long of all the stuff he sees in the Reichswald, the order of battle that he's able to put together, which corresponds perfectly with what Ultra has been picking up. It's absolutely remarkable what this guy does. So impressive, this is bumped up to Schaeff, and Schaeff ends up redistributing what he did to the entire army in the West. Say, look, this is what you're supposed to do if you're ever taken prisoner. So, of course, there's a bit of an ironic ending or a sad ending to this, because, of course, immediately they think we've got to honor him. So they give him the Military Cross. And 2 weeks later, they send him back to England for his investiture at Buckingham Palace, and he's killed on landing when the plane crashes. And so he goes down as one of the most amazing aspects. And it's kind of strange to be talking about the exploits of one person. But when you take a look at the paperwork, you realize just the amazing contribution he made to corroborating what they had already discovered, or in many cases, what they would discover in the Reichswald forest. And so that was just, one incredible episode that we tend to forget in all this. But generally speaking, it wasn't so much about the enemy forces per se that they were starting to concentrate on, because they had already had a good background on this, on German forces in the Reichswald, but it was the terrain itself.
Yeah.
And they realized that the terrain was going to be the ultimate force modifier in this, force enhancer. And so they spent a lot of time working on that issue. And of course, as you know, you're not only fighting through wooded area, which has, periodic hills inside, but the Reichswald forest itself is a man-made forest. It's done for logging purposes. So it's done in a specific symmetrical pattern. And so as a result, you've got these long lanes of fire that the Germans can use. They can basically set up a machine gun about 1/2 kilometer away, and it can fire right down these lanes. It makes it very, very difficult. And of course, there's flooding. It's February. It's, it's a hard slog for infantry. But what you don't also realize is you're not just coming through the forest. Part of your forces are coming out through open fields and heading towards Goch and Calcar and Cleve, all these towns, which have basically been fortified like, hedgehogs like you would see in Normandy. So you have two different types of approaches that you have to take. And this is very difficult to deal with, to say the least. But part of what Mike was touching on before about the idea of the Canadians getting their act together over the winter break, if you will, was that they were able to successfully navigate this, as were the British.
Yeah, I like the fact, you're talking about, imagine there's someone at a briefing for this veritable operation and someone asking the officer, so what are we dealing with ahead of us, sir? Are we dealing with floods, forests, urban warfare? Yes, is the answer. Yeah, all of that and above. So Arthur and Mike, the Allies, by spring 45, they've learned that over-promising and under-delivering on operations has been something that people will pick up on, and historians have particularly picked up on that 80 years later. The wording of Montgomery's Operation Goodwood still hanging over him. So with Veritable, what are the Allies hoping to achieve? What are they saying they're going to try and do? Mike, the same question to you as well. What is the point of Operation Veritable? Obviously, getting closer to into Germany and battling the Germans, but in operational terms, Mike, Arthur, which one of you wants? Arthur first.
Sure, I'll go. There's 3 phases to this battle. First is to clear the defensive line in front of the Reichswald. That's the first one. Then another 3.5 miles down the road through the forest, through those terrible tracks. You're supposed to clear and destroy the enemy occupying the northern part of the Siegfried line around that Matterborn and Cleve area, where it gets a little bit more open, where the tanks and vehicles can go. And then the third is the Hochwald layback position, which they're going to clear as well to set up for what is the subsequent British operation. I'm having a brain freeze right now. What is it? It's after Veritable. It's Blockbuster. Yes, to set up for Blockbuster. And there's something that's really sort of screwed them up as well. The British 30th Corps and later the 2nd Canadian Corps are not attacking in unison with the American forces because of the terrible flooding that's gone on to the south on the Maas due to some German activities and blocking things, flooding areas, and grenade gets delayed tremendously. So this battle sort of goes on in isolation, and it's very good for the Germans because they can dump in fresh reserves that potentially would have been sent to fight the Americans. So it's very good for them. But this is a slow, grinding, ugly, muddy, messy battle, and you've been to that house party everybody has where they have too many people in a hallway and you're sort of elbowing your way through. You have these, how many divisions have we got here? We've got from north to south, the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division, the 15th Scottish Division, the 53rd Welsh Division, the 51st Highland Division. Then stacked up behind that is the 52nd Division. And then there's all the independent armored brigades that support all this with the specialist and normal armor. And so there's just not enough room for these divisions. Each one of them is fully up to strength with 20,000 men. So we have nearly, what is it? I got it written down here. It's 50,000 men, 500 tanks in this tremendously small confined area. So it's the problem is traffic. They can't unleash all this strength at once. And it's a problem of rotating out and relieving units and then going on to the next objective. And at some point in the battle, they have a terrible traffic jam that's almost 16 kilometers long. It's because each infantry division has almost, these hundreds of vehicles attached, hundreds of armored vehicles of every possible type. There's just spaces in that absolute premium. And on top of that, you've have some areas flooded and everything's going to hell in a handbasket when it comes to these flooded areas and these muddy roads.
And Mike, you know, when we had Dermot on a couple of weeks ago, he was talking about the seeds. He's making the case that the seeds of Operation Veritable will go right back to Arnhem and Market Garden, because it's about getting into that, you know, heartland of Germany. And you know, Market Garden has taught the Allies that bold going up a single route, which gives you that ability to kind of thrust and be dynamic, can go completely wrong. And as you've all been saying, you've now got these assets of all these vehicle pools behind. It's one of the things that has got the Allies from Normandy to this part of Germany is the incredible rear supply, the Royal Army Ordnance Corps, the Royal Electrical Mechanical Engineers, who've kept that Canadian Army on its wheels, on its tracks, all the way from Normandy. And so you've got these assets. So you've got, you don't want to leave them behind, but making room for that stuff is so. At an operational level, how difficult is it for the commanders to balance that, moving all the big toys they've got, but at the same point being kind of dynamic and trying to be bold? Because as Arthur said, it's got the writing on the wall is saying this is going to be a trudging, grudging, mudslinging, awful, which is what it ended up being. But was there consideration given to something a bit more kind of dynamic?
Yeah, there's a lot going on here. I want to just back up and sort of comment on a point that Arthur made first about Operation Grenade, and it was supposed to be set off at the same time as Veritable, like Arthur said. And it's kind of a good news, bad news, because it was delayed 2 weeks. It meant that the Germans could pull forces from in front of the Americans and throw them against 1st Canadian Army. It made it much more difficult for the Canadians to go. But then the other side of that is once Grenade was launched, they just had free reign to go because there wasn't much in front of them anymore, and it allowed the Americans to move very quickly up to the Rhine. And then conversely, that once again later helped the Canadians once they were sort of getting closer to Xanten and Wesel, because the Germans had to pull back or risk being encircled. So the operation didn't work out the way they originally sort of gamed it, but it maybe didn't work out so bad in the end. You'd asked before about what the intent of Veritable was, and I think for Montgomery it was very simple. It was to be an attritional battle to destroy the German army in place. Very simple, nothing fancy. It was meant to just clobber the Germans and kill German soldiers so they couldn't be pulled out to fight anywhere else. General Crerar, commander of 1st Canadian Army, looked at how things were going and saw an opportunity to cross the Rhine at Arnhem, sort of Market Garden V2, and get across onto the north bank of the Rhine River and sort of start to outflank the Germans by going down both sides. And Montgomery kiboshed that right away. He didn't want maneuver. He didn't want elegance. He just wanted a straight ahead bashing battle to destroy the Germans. So he didn't let Crerar do that. Now, in terms of it being a complex battle, absolutely it was. The Allies had a lot of stuff. And it wasn't just infantry and armor. It was all of those other services that make a modern army effective. Engineers and supply, smoke generators, different types of armor. I mean, infantry tanks and Shermans and 79th Armored Division. You've got amphibious vehicles like the Buffalo, which were absolutely essential for 3rd Canadian Division to get through the flooded area on the northern flank of Veritable. The LVT-4 for our American friends, absolutely essential. I mean, 3rd Division got nicknamed the Water Rats because it seemed like they were always fighting in water from the Scheldt right through here at the Rhine, and it was sort of their specialty by this point in the war. But there was a professionalism in the Allied armies that perhaps wasn't there earlier on in Normandy. The commanders knew how to orchestrate all these various pieces, how to make the plans, how to make sure that there were appropriate routes to get forces up to the front and things back, and how to stage things and how to prepare it. And there was a lot of planning going on. So nothing was done ad hoc. Nothing was just sprung at all. It was always well planned, well organized, well thought out, so that they could make the best use of all those resources. Because after all, that was the advantage the Allies had. They had an advantage in stuff, and they wanted to spend shells, not lives, to get this war over.
Yeah, if we could just jump in, I think this is, Mike was touching on it. This is Harry Crear's finest moment. you know, without a doubt. I mean, he's very much of a World War One, latter half World War One style technocratic general. I mean, he's not a Simmons in the sense that, you know, Simmons was straight to the point. And it would have been interesting. And again, you know, I'm going to have some fun with throwing out a counterfactual here, but what would be, you know, it would have been interesting to see Simmons' approach to this. If he had maintained his command of the army. Of course, as some of you probably know, he took over temporarily when Harry Crerar got sick, and now Crerar has come back. And the overwhelming consensus at Crear's staff, or at 1st Canadian Army headquarters amongst his staff, was when Simmons showed up, it was a breath of fresh air. Because Harry Crerar was very bureaucratic in his approach, and everything was like a toot. In other words, a tactical exercise without troops. He was constantly calling meetings. Instead of, you know, letting his staff officers get on with their day, he was always calling meetings. And you can see that in the record starting in January when he comes back. And so, given the fact that he was given the grace of time to be able to prepare it, etc., it went very well, likely because he, you know, paid attention to detail. What would have been fascinating, though, is to see Simmons' approach, which basically would be to come in and say, do it yesterday, and it would get done. So I'm wondering, you know, and I'm throwing it out there for fun and for discussion, whether that would have made much of a difference given the terrain and everything else. Certainly, I'm not sure whether it would have saved lives or sped up anything, but it certainly would have reduced the stress on his poor staff officers, to say the least.
Mike, Arthur, a reaction to that?
Yeah, the Allies had a very deliberate bite and hold strategy throughout this battle, that they wouldn't just set their troops free and sort of let them go as far as they could until they got expended. The German strategy has always been deliberate and immediate counterattacks on any breakthrough or advance, and the Allies knew this, and they also knew the best way to kill Germans was to take something, hold it, and then call in the artillery to hit the Germans as they're coming up out of the open, out of their defenses to come at them, because they're in the open and they're easiest to kill then. So when they went into urban areas, especially, they would send one company in at a time, who would then grab a base, hold it, and then another company would come in. It was very deliberate. It was very calculated. It wasn't freewheeling. It wasn't fast, but it was designed to use Allied advantages and to minimize casualties.
We talk a lot on the channel about the dearth of memoirs by people who fought in 45, even if they've been there early on. Everyone's just, we said it earlier, they're knackered, they're exhausted, and you see people's willingness to just write down their experiences just plummet as you go from Normandy, or you see it in Italy from the beach landings right up to the latter part of the war in 45. Everyone's just fed up now. So do we have an idea about how difficult or easy this was to sell to the guys down there? Because as I said earlier, 44-45 winter has been an epidemic of self-inflicted wounds and desertions, and morale is at a low point generally across the ETO. So people are kind of, if you're a GI or a Tommy or a Canadian and so on, you're kind of wanting the operation coming up to be the one that's going to bring the swift end of the war, to bring you back home, so you're there for spring, back in to see the football season start, whatever it would be. So how do you sell a bite and hold campaign like this, or do they just don't care about selling it? You just follow your orders.
Oh, it's very much a bite and hold operation. The British soldiers at this stage, they know Germany is a huge country. They know it'll have to be conquered, as well as, that they have a tremendous amount to go towards Berlin. They're not, they can read a map as good as anybody else, but they also know that a tremendous amount of firepower is behind them for each and every operation. And with this bite and hold, we're going to capture our objective, and that's what we have to do. We don't have to go past that. We just capture it, fight our battle, then dig in, and somebody else, the next infantry battalion, will take over the next attack. And we've got all these Wasps and Crocodiles and Arv Petard tanks and 1,034 guns here of all these infantry divisions. And I should also, you got 3 Canadians on here. This is a very much almost a British operation, in that this is the 30th Corps, which is the best British infantry divisions, and a whole pile of them. And while we have the 2nd and 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, the British have a huge amount of leadership going on to control the battle, to plan the battle at the 30th Corps level, and also to fight it. Now, this sort of changes once the 2nd Canadian Corps gets a little bit more unleashed, and they have the fighting with the 47th Panzer Corps, which is very weak, but a majority of some of the biggest battles are with the Canadians. But for that initial bite through the forest, it is very much a British operation. But the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division and the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, they do definitely do their jobs. But the British fight their way through the initial, I think, 1st and 2nd lines of defenses with these superb British infantry divisions that are very much fighting a British infantry division battle. It's not a tank battle. It's very much chew, 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 crumble, 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 bite, 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 bomb, bomb, bomb. Here come the bombers. Here come the fighter bombers. Again, here comes the Typhoons. And so while there are some difficult moments for the British, I think mud and traffic congestion is also some of the biggest things they have to worry about, and actual boredom. And of course, nobody wants to be the last to die in the Second World War, but they also want to get on with it as well. And these traffic jams are just epic.
Yeah, I think the shout out. I think the shout out here, really. I mean, not that you're gonna. Well, in this case, maybe singling somebody out or singling a corps out would be the engineers. I mean, this really is an engineer battle. I mean, you have to bring in bulldozers. You have to repair particular roads if you can. You have to shore them up. I mean, they've got orders to go out and intentionally rubble buildings to be able to then bulldoze the rubble into the various gaps on the road to maintain the momentum. And that's really what it is. Even though this is a slow pace done over 3 phases, momentum in any attack is so important. When you've got your opponent on the rope, you got to go for the kill, but you need the momentum to do that. And of course, not only are we talking about the logistics and the ordnance keeping up, but more importantly, the engineers, I mean, they're the ones who are maintaining the arteries and the veins in all of this. And so, I think a lot of the engineer work in any battle, but particularly this one, can sort of, go under the radar a little bit.
No, absolutely. And we've got that shot there of a carrier stuck in the mud there. And I think, we talked about it with PT Knight a few weeks ago about the development of British tank tactics, about you've got to look at that whole, in Arthur's first book, you've got to look at that whole power behind the armor, all that, as I've said earlier, the workshops, it's engineering in all of its use of words. It's the machine shops to repair things, as well as the practical repairing of roads and repairing of bridges. But as we've got the 3 Canadians, you reminded us that we're Canadian here. Let's take a look at a couple of the actual Canadian operations as part of it, because we have Christopher Jarry coming on later on, talking about some of the British 43rd division as they push in towards Germany, not quite directly part of Veritable, but the same kind of forest by forest, town by town. We had Andy Aitchison on a few weeks ago talking about the 52nd Lowland Division and the fighting there. But let's talk about this. Let's talk about the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division and some of their involvement in the early stages of Veritable. So Arthur, you sent me this map, so kick us off with this one.
Yes, this is the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division has a limited role in the battle, and they literally run out of room. They get squeezed out of it after this attack, which is actually very successful, and it clears these. The Germans fight for a bit, and then they surrender. But you see, this is how the infantry battalions fought, always not fighting with the first, the full 4 line companies, but usually attacking with 3 or sometimes even with 2, and then having a further, reserve. And of course would be the attached tanks, and they push into, where it's not flooded or not muddy, but that's a large portion of the area there, and as well as wooded. But they slowly but surely push through and capture these towns, and they set up the sort of launching point for the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, which becomes, of course, the famous water rats as they get into the LCTs and cruise through these very much completely amphibious operations to find Germans that, more often than not, very much want to surrender. They fight, making some token resistance, but the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division actually makes some of the best progress in that, it gets from A to B quickly due to these excellent amphibious vehicles. And then, when they meet the Germans, they either surrender quickly or they fight for a bit and, then surrender. So the Canadian Infantry Division, even though it's just terrible fighting, they're fighting the environment more than they are the Germans, but they make tremendous progress.
Brilliant stuff. We talked about this David, you talked about operational tempo, and we put the map up again there of all the different types of terrain they have to go through. So you've got, as you said, Arthur said, they've got the floods, you've got the forest, you've got fortified cities, you've got not limited, but you're not quite sure what the German reaction is going to be. How on earth do you coordinate something like this? Okay, the Allies theoretically have got good communications, forward observers, that. But Mike, this is it looks complicated on the map there, and that map is simplified because we've kind of got 2 or 3 arrows per division when it actually goes down much more complicated than that. But give us a rundown of what happens of let's say the first 48 hours of Veritable. You're muted, Mike.
Sorry about that. My dogs were barking in the background, and I was trying to spare you of that. The first 48 hours is very successful in terms of pushing slowly forward. The artillery is used to great effect. Some of the largest barrages of the entire war. It was interesting reading the 21st Army Group report on Veritable, and they said that the artillery was so effective and so accurate on D-Day that there was absolutely no friendly fire casualties from the artillery, which is quite remarkable. But I think you can also chalk that up to the fact that they were firing on known German enemy positions at that point, and for the most part, the positions of the British and Canadian troops was entirely known. That certainly changed as the battle went on. An operational research study later in the battle found that when they looked at British and Canadian casualties and pulled the shell splinters out of them, a very high proportion of them were found to be Allied shells that were causing those casualties, which is not surprising. I mean, you're fighting in a very chaotic battle in the woods, and you might not know exactly where your troops are at all the time. So artillery was very effective and very essential to getting the job done, but it was a blunt weapon, regardless of how accurate it would be. Progress was slow and steady in those first 48 hours. Each division had to basically fight an infantry battle. I mean, we've talked about all the supporting arms, the armor, the flamethrowers, the artillery, air power, things like that. But when it came right down to it, it was an infantry battle. The infantry had to go in and winkle out the Germans. And there was one, the Scottish division actually did a bayonet charge on the Germans. They were not getting through to where they needed to. The Germans weren't giving up. So the company commander ordered a charge across 200 yards of open ground. And fortunately, the Germans broke and run. There was a few casualties amongst the Allied troops, but it got the job done. So this is a nasty infantry battle. And even though they've got all these force multipliers, at the end of the day, it was the infantry that had to carry the battle for them.
A good point. And do we want to touch on the Moyland Wood, or is that too far into the battle? We got still more things to say about the early stages, the first week or so, or do you want to carry on a bit more?
I think we can carry on.
Okay, well let's do that then, because there's another map that that Arthur sent me. So where are we? There we go. So this, and Dermot is in the sidebar there. I may bring Dermot in the chat later on. So the Veritable, according to Wikipedia, is a month. So it's a long drawn out operation that kind of morphs into other things. But first 48 hours, you said went quite well. Arthur, take us on for the next few days.
Yes, the cities of Cleve and Goch have been destroyed by 750 RAF heavy bombers, and of course there's the cratering that goes along with the on the roads and the flooded areas. So we have sort of an operational pause by around the 13th. But then again, they get going, and the 2nd Canadian Corps is deployed. So we see the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division, the 3rd Canadian Infantry, or the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, there's not too much room for it in the confined area. But this point, they make the decision on halfway through the month there, or halfway after the end of the first battle I believe it's on the 12th. They make the decision to bring in the 47th Panzer Corps, and this is, of course, the mobile armored reserve of the 86th Corps, to go in and put a stop to this, to halt them before they can break out further into Germany. So the 84th Infantry Division is slowly but surely relieved, and we have bits and pieces of the 6th and 7th Parachute Divisions for the Germans, as well as the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, which is quite weak because it's fought in the Ardennes. So it goes against the British, and against us is the 116th Panzer Division, which also has a small camp group for a battle group of the Panzer Lehr Panzer Division as well added onto this. Despite all these names on the map, they're tremendously weak, and they can scrape up between all this forces maybe 50 tanks. And then they have the remnants of the Tank Hunter Battalion, which had been firing down those forest roads at the British, and then retreating and picking up another position. But now, as the Canadian Infantry Brigades deploy and begin to clear these woods, they get into something that's very foreign, which is an open area, farmers' fields that aren't flooded. And this is very good armored country. But the Canadian Infantry Divisions and the battalions also have their wonderful support companies that come with them and deploy to consolidate their objectives into a fortress. So when the Germans do strike, they're met with a hail of anti-tank gunfire, the armor that's in the area supporting the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division, as well as the FU teams that are there launching these tremendous artillery concentrations on the Germans. Some Canadian infantry battalions do have a very tough time. The Royal Regiment of Canada is one of them. They get some of their companies overwhelmed by these German tank commanders that are driving forward in a very determined fashion, but the Germans are very weak. So as far as fighting a sustained Kursk-style Eastern Front super armored battle, they just haven't got the gas to do it in their gas tank. So the Canadians are somewhat halted and forced to fight this defensive battle against the Germans, and the Germans do halt them, but the parachute troops are well motivated, but they are light infantry troops, these parachutists, and they're motivated. They fight very hard. The Luftwaffe still has some very good formations, but as far as driving this whole British 30th Corps and Canadian 2nd Corps monster back, that's absolutely out of the question. It's impossible, but they do their best to halt the Canadian thrust forward by savaging the infantry battalions the best they can, but they can't really accomplish very much, and they lose a number of their precious and irreplaceable by this stage tanks. And you can see right there the road network, very good for the Allies. It starts to open up. So you get the east-west roads, as well as these, not just the totally unusable north-south roads, because that's the whole axis of the Canadian 2nd Corps advance. So this is one of Simmons', best, grinding battles, in that he pushes forward. But it's not exactly spectacular, but it inflicts Germans losses on the Germans. And of course, this 47th Panzer Corps, which is deployed here, it can't fight the Americans. And this aids Operation Grenade tremendously by taking the fight to what is left of the good portions of the German army that are still in action here with the 1st Parachute Army.
It's fascinating what he's talking about, because both to touch on what Mike and what Arthur have been talking about, what a difference 7 months makes. When you think about this kind of style of fighting that they were getting accustomed or acquainted with in Normandy, and how they've been able to truly harness it and understand it by the time they get here. Now, of course, obviously there was a hell of a hard school in between, but you have the infantry advancing over areas that are doable. In other words, they're not overreaching. Their phase lines are there. They're appropriately spaced. They're not outrunning their artillery. They're not overexposing themselves or overextending themselves the way they did in Normandy. They have also been able to speed up that tempo of being able to get on an objective and consolidate, understanding exactly what's coming. You certainly understood that in Normandy, but it was a question of, really perfecting it. And also with high command, as Mike mentioned earlier, they've had a chance to really absorb, enriching, I think it was the best way Mike put it, was they've been enriched by those experiences. And you can certainly see this here. They're not losing battalions like they were in Normandy because they are learning the game. They now understand it and they're taking it to the Germans.
Well, I want to expand on that with Mike, because Mike, you said about this isn't the Canadian Army, the British Army of months, certainly years earlier. So on face value, the photos of the British and Canadians in Veritable, it's the same gears they've got in Normandy. It's the number 4, it's the Sten gun, it's the Bren guns and what have you. But there's what assets, what have the Allies, the Canadians particularly, got good at since Normandy? I mean, David talking about this aggressive patrolling and intel gathered back there. I mean, because you said it is an infantryman's battle. The mud is causing issues for the armor, for the vehicles there. But are there some particular skill sets that the Canadians have developed since Normandy that you can kind of put your finger on? That's where they've improved.
Yeah, and I'm not sure it's particularly Canadian in this case, but artillery is an interesting story. I mean, if we cast our eyes back to the First World War and Vimy, the barrage before Vimy was over a week long. I mean, the Germans called it the week of hell. And that's what they thought they needed to prepare the defenses for being overcome. D-Day, it was all about drenching firepower, the heavy bombers, the cruisers, the battleships, the rocket landing craft, everything like that as a way of overcoming those defenses. Same in Normandy. Any big offensive was always teed off by a heavy bomber strike on the German defenses as a way of preparing the ground. For Operation Veritable, it was a 3-hour barrage, kicked off at something like 7:30 in the morning, and the infantry left the start line 3 hours later. That's very different, and it says it says a lot about how the Allies viewed a battle and how they prepared for it. You can take that one step farther, and the Americans in Operation Grenade, their preparatory barrage was 45 minutes. Germans weren't ready for it. It was almost a surprise attack. And it says a lot about how they're planning their battles at this point. So things are changing. They are integrating new weapons in ways that make a big difference. I found a quote that I think is worth reading about the Kangaroos. The Kangaroos, of course, is the armored personnel carrier that was introduced by Simmons in Normandy, and they were a key component of protecting the artillery, protecting the infantry in Operation Veritable. And the 21st Army Group report said, and this is quite remarkable, it has been said that since the substitution of the musket for the crossbow, there has been no development in infantry equipment which is comparable to the arrival of the Kangaroo. I mean, that's substantial. Switching from a crossbow to a musket has the same impact as using the APC. And I mean, I get it. I mean, these were dangerous battlefields for the infantry with machine gun fire and shell fire and splinters and everything like that. And perhaps the most dangerous point was getting the infantry to that departure point, to the point where they can close with and grip the enemy. And if you can put them in an armored box to get them through the worst of it, it makes a big difference. And these Kangaroos were used to the point of almost depletion in this battle because they were so important and so needed in almost every situation for the battles.
Brilliant. We had a great question from Stephen about the use of artillery and particularly fuses, because you said earlier, Arthur, how you're fighting through floods. There's urban fortified cities. There's forests as well. So you're firing artillery shells into different types of terrain. So Stephen's particular question was, did the mud change up the types of fuses used? And Dermot is in the sidebar. Maybe he can throw in his response to that as well, because he's kind of an artillery expert. But has there been an attempt to anticipate the types of terrain the artillery will be fired from and firing into, and what they can do about that?
Something important to also think about is the artillery shells. For the majority of this battle, they never touched the ground. What they did is explode in treetops and spin the shards into the, right on top of the Germans, which is absolutely terrible. So, you're having these shells that are hitting these trees. Yeah, and yes, the things are becoming much more sophisticated in the way of fuses, and when they're going to exactly go off, how close to the ground will they go off, the air bursts. There's also a lot of artillery units that you don't think of as being field or indirect fire. The use of the British Royal Artillery and Royal Canadian Artillery anti-aircraft units, they'd be firing as well, very much so, as well as these rockets and these land mattresses and things like that. So yes, it was almost like an experimental camp of, we have all these toys now, well, let's use them all at once. And the effect is absolutely spectacular. In an artillery sense, the Germans are very much limited at this stage. They can't really do counter battery fire. They can't fight a rich man's war when it comes to artillery, but they still use their mortars and their light infantry guns, the infantry Geschütz, the 75 millimeter and 150 millimeter that's at the Grenadier Regiment level, to the best of their ability, but they have nothing in the way of able to fight this spectacular artillery battle that just basically, it only stops for some of the regiments and the batteries when the gunners are sleeping. It's and of course another battery takes over. Well, they have their little sleeping break, and they're bringing up more shells. So it's not how are we going to fight this? It's what can't we do? It's very much, it's a spectacular amusement park of artillery. It's Disneyland for artillery, because they can do basically anything they want. And it's they've had all of this time in the Nijmegen salient to build up this huge stockpile of shells that and then they get an extra month to build up a huge amount of shells. And the port of Antwerp is open, and the Canadian infantry battalions, I should also mention this, going with the kangaroos, they have the first zombies. You're saying, what's a zombie? Of course, this conscription is taken over in Canada, and in February, March, we see the first of these soldiers arrive. Usually the ones that did not want to go into the active service force, but now have been conscripted due to the conscription crisis back in Canada, and Mackenzie King going back and forth, and finally they've arrived. But the kangaroo is also an amazing thing in that it's very much the hot commodity, and it's passed around from infantry brigade to infantry brigade, from battalion to battalion. Everybody wants to use it. It's like the ride on the amusement park that everybody, because it means less casualties, right? So it's amazing there, and there should be lots more of them. And of course, the post-war NATO armies take this as a huge lesson in what works, and it becomes the staple of the British Army of the Rhine and the NATO armies of the Cold War.
So I want to bring Mike and David in now about this. Maintaining an attritional campaign is easier done with the tech. Artillery barrels maybe only need 30 minutes to let them cool down, and they're ready to go again. The same with some, you switch a tank's engine off, it cools down. But human beings, keeping an operational tempo with human beings in an attritional campaign is much tougher. So David and Mike, in terms of the accounts of the boots on the ground, the Tommies, the Canadians, they're in these individuals, how do we have an idea of where they are physically after, say, 10 days, 2 weeks into this? I mean, are they getting breaks, or is it fairly relentless?
No, they're definitely getting breaks, because as Arthur mentioned earlier, they're rotating in.
Yeah.
And this is very key. I mean, generally speaking, they're going in a brigade with three battalions. They're going with one up. And so that means they can then leapfrog through, which then provides the proper rest that well, maybe not proper rest, but at least a rest going through. But to get back to what we've been harping on, momentum. And that's one of the reasons why the Kangaroo is so important, because the Kangaroo can bring those reserves up very quickly. And before the Germans can catch their breath, there's another fresh Allied battalion or Canadian battalion already pressing down on them, or relatively fresh. It even gets to the point by the end where, you know, some of the Canadian brigade commanders, one of them, the 5th Brigade, McGill, is getting pretty cocky. And when it comes to what he thinks he can do with Kangaroos. And one of them is basically pushing through about 9 miles and trying to bounce the Rhine River by basically taking his brigade, moving them in Kangaroos and getting them to the Rhine and over the Rhine quicker. The Germans blow the bridge and that's scuttled. But the point is that that's the way they're thinking. That's the kind of impact that things like the Kangaroo are making on this. And so as a result, I mean, there's no doubt that the infantry, regardless of what battle you're in, and particularly this kind of terrain, you're going to feel it and you're going to be tired. But it's not like what we were talking about near the end of the Normandy campaign, where they really are in need of a break, where infantry casualties, although high here, are not irreplaceable. You are getting sufficient infantry trained reinforcements coming in to take over. So you're not ending up the same way that you did after Normandy. But without a doubt, I mean, it's, you know, going through that kind of terrain, it's going to take a lot out of you. But the fact is, it's offset by the numbers and the way that they've been rotating them in.
Mike, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, there's the standard battle exhaustion casualties that are being suffered. I mean, you see that in Normandy, you see it in the Scheldt, and of course you see it here in the Rhineland. It's the nature of the fighting. It's close combat. It's intense. It's infantry intensive. So guys break down, and nobody's really figured out, well, then or now, how to deal with that, and they just have to figure out how to deal with those casualties as they happen. But it drains the ranks of the frontline infantry as well. But I mean, the Allies are making progress, and I think progress helps with the mental state of the troops. They know they're getting the job done. They might not always know exactly what's going on. Sort of it was brought up before about whether the troops on the ground understood what was happening, and I think it's safe to say no, they didn't. They were just going in, and their world was their section or their platoon or maybe their company, and not much bigger. And if you look at for instance, Operation Blockbuster, the attack on the Hochwald, you've got 3 Canadian divisions going in, 2nd, 4th Armored, and 3rd, but they're working together, and it's very clear that they're being coordinated at a higher level, but that wouldn't have been apparent to the troops on the ground in any way, shape, or form. They're fighting in close terrain, in wooded terrain, and really they see their buddies on either side of them, and not much more to them. So for the grunts on the ground, they don't know what's happening, but there is a very good, well thought out plan that is being executed at the Allied level.
Well, we will be losing David in about 10 minutes. He has to drive through the commuter traffic to get to work. But I want to talk more about the legacy of Veritable and maybe where we are in historiography, because in terms of you being the 3 Canadian musketeers, you know, Dieppe, Hong Kong, the Scheldt Estuary, even Normandy, I would think, are still more of the hot potatoes of topics amongst the military historian fraternity. But where are we amongst it with Veritable? You know, David Patterson is in the sidebar there talking about being there with Dennis Whitaker and consulting with Terry Cobb. Where does Veritable sit? Have we sorted it all out? Have we got it all tied up, or is it still being debated? Are there mysteries, Mike or David, Arthur?
Yeah, I mean, in the Canadian consciousness, it's D-Day Normandy, D-Day Normandy, D-Day Normandy. The Scheldt, I mean, I've said it before, I think that's the most important battle campaign the Canadians fought in the Second World War. I would say the Rhineland's not far behind that. I mean, this is a big battle for 1st Canadian Army. David was exactly right in saying this was perhaps Carrera's finest point in the campaign. They had a big, complex task to accomplish. Yeah. Carrera had more troops under his command than at any other point in the war, and he got the job done. He did it very well and very effectively, and it was crucial. They fought Montgomery's attritional battle, and they destroyed wide swaths of the German army in closing to the Rhine. It was difficult. It was intense. It was costly, but they got the job done.
Yeah, we barely talk about it.
Yeah. And why don't we talk about David? I mean, to me, it's kind of like, you know, I don't know, to use a sporting analogy, it's like your team is several goals, whichever sport you're talking about, and you kind of walk out the stadium 10 minutes before the final whistle because you want to get back in your car and go back home. And I feel there's that loss of interest in World War II after about February. It's like, well, we're going to win now. It's like we've done the Ardennes now, and I feel that people's interest, except on World War II TV, just drops off a proverbial cliff because there's an inevitability about it. Is that a struggle we're facing of just keeping people's interest in this part of the war, David?
Yeah, I think you're spot on. I mean, you know, we're starting to talk about the liberation of the camps, the post-war world, the final collapse. And I think you're right. I mean, the analogy is, you know, it's like Man U beating up on a last place team, you know, 5 or 6-0. And
Man, you aren't beating up on anybody right now. Keep up to date, David.
Sorry. Let me go with my Gunners.
I've just
outed myself. There you go.
Moment right
now.
There
you go. Kind of beating, you know, Ipswich.
Everybody beats Ipswich. That's no biggie. But
that's sort of the thing, right? I mean, it's one of those things where, like, look, this is, you know, it's slow, it's ugly, it's deadly, it's costly. Maybe it is, of course, like we said, career's finest hour. But there isn't really, except if you were there, inherent drama in this. Yeah. The way we see in the other battles, right? Or we've missed perhaps the human story here because you know, as we get towards the end of the war, it's like, oh, well, the war's over. You know, you really didn't suffer that much in here, which really isn't the case when you dig down. But it's never really made, you know, the top flight part of historiography, particularly Canadian historiography.
And Arthur, the German army at the end of Veritable, I mean, or you can talk about Canadians as well. I mean, we have the image of the Germans, the German kids defending Berlin with Panzerfaust and things like that we get to within a few weeks there, and the Volkssturm, and more reliance on not even second rate, third and fourth rate. I mean, at the end of Veritable in this part of the world, what's left of the German army? Because did it have the attritional success that everybody, what Montgomery wanted?
Yes, it very much did attrit what German units were involved to a tremendous degree. And of course, this sets up a blockbuster. And then the real end to the German armies in the West, which is the encirclement in the Rhine pocket, where some of the best units are, you know, and Field Marshal Model walks out into the woods and shoots himself. And it's a disaster from that point on. And, you know, what's not surrendering is running away to a huge degree, or the tanks are running out of gas. And it's the period of March where the German resistance is rather ferocious around Berlin and the approaches to Berlin against the Red Army. We see this almost complete collapse that takes place after Blockbuster and Veritable and some of the American operations charging through on this wide front. And the Germans can't be everywhere. Yes, the question of where this fits into the Canadian historiography. This book, you know, the official history, it was so good. It was so good in that it felt like it almost did the job. And there's, you know, the very much the firsthand accounts of Mark Zulke and some other books, the Dennis Whitaker books on some of the late war period, also very, very good. But potentially some of the best books have yet to be written on Veritable and Blockbuster. And it's a tremendous opportunity, you know, think that, you know, the Second World War is some kind of burnt out asset for Canadian military historians. It's I don't believe it's anywhere near that. So yes, there can be new books, and they should and can be written. But we'll see what the next 10 years brings.
Well, Dermot is doing a British focus one and lots of artillery. That's he's. Well, I think the manuscript is done. He'll confirm, but he's saying we need a Canadian historian to relook at Veritable and Blockbuster. And so, before we lose David and what are everybody really? What are final words on Veritable? Mike. Well, let's go David first.
Well, I think basically just the underappreciated battle that the Canadians fight. I mean, after this, we end up getting into what I always consider to be Canada's finest moment, which is the liberation of the Netherlands. But you don't get there without this hard fighting. This is a hard slug that needs to be won, without a doubt. If you don't get the proper footing on the west bank of the Rhine, you're not getting very, farther. Also, too, remember historically what the Rhine means for Germany. This is the jump off point for invasions of the West. This is symbolically extremely important. It's another notch, you know, if you will, that's being taken out of the German war effort. This is just another kick in the groin. And it's a damn good one, without a doubt, that the Canadians and the Brits put in here, for sure. So I think just a question of it being underappreciated. And I think that's really, you know, that's really where we sit at this moment.
Thank you. Mike?
Yeah, I mean, the Canadians did great. There were 2 Canadian Victoria Crosses awarded in the Rhineland, which was impressive. A third one later in Operation Varsity. So it gives you a sense of the intensity of the combat and what the Canadian soldiers were doing. I can't leave off without giving one more plug to air power. For me, it's quite a remarkable story looking at the development of air power from Normandy, where it was kind of finding its way to a really well-realized system that they had in the Rhineland with visual control posts and forward control posts and definite really good cooperation between the Army and the Air Force. And reading the 21st Army Group report again, it was quite remarkable that the Army has always been on about, we need close air support. We want to see what the Army, what the Air Force is doing in front of us, because if they're doing something far away, we don't know about it and we don't care about it. The 21st Army Group report actually said, we don't want the Air Force bombing cities because it causes problems for us. The shell holes, bomb craters make it difficult for us to move around, gives the Germans more places to dig in and defend, makes it easy for them to booby trap everything. We'd rather them not destroy these towns and villages because it makes our job harder. Second, they said, and this to me is absolutely remarkable, they said that they would rather have the Air Force doing interdiction, bombing those railway junctions, roads, rail lines, and stopping the Germans from reinforcing the front line, because that's where they're having their biggest effect on the battlefront. I don't think I've ever seen that in print before, and I was flabbergasted when I saw that in an Army report, that they're actually realizing the value of interdiction and isolating the battlefield. So that gives you a sense of how far we've come from 1940 to 1944 to here we are in February, March 45. So lots of interesting things going on.
Well, it's been a brilliant chat, but as always, we'll leave people wanting more. Maybe we'll schedule something else and talk about the next stage in a few weeks' time on World War II TV. But in the meantime, tomorrow, folks, we've got John Coratola coming on talking about how the American Army learned to cross bodies of water based on his new book, Armies Afloat, which he's counting the Rhine as basically the last big amphibious operation of World War II. So that's coming up tomorrow, and then lots more good stuff. But in the meantime, thanks for all your questions. Don't forget to click like and subscribe and buy my guests' books. So we will see you all again next time. This is Paul Woodadge for World War II TV saying enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.